My husband lashed me 20 times in the middle of the living room because of his mistress. My mother-in-law looked away coldly, and my sister-in-law smirked. In silence, I called my father and said, "Dad, I regret it." No one knew that this single phone call would lead to the bankruptcy of my husband's company in just 3 days. How could a phone call shake the foundations of an entire family? And how did the man who wielded the belt that day end up with nothing? I still remember that night with chilling clarity. It was a night when not even the summer heat could melt the frost emanating from the eyes of the people I called family. The living room was lit as usual, the light spilling over the gleaming hardwood furniture. It was the furniture my mother-in-law always bragged about, claiming no other house in the neighborhood had such a high-end American leather sofa set. But the more I looked at them, the emptier my heart felt. The house was filled with expensive objects, but human affection had dried up long ago. My husband, James, stood in the center of the house, shouting with the veins in his neck bulging. His sharp voice seemed to tear the air apart. "Who do you think you are? You dare to send a message to Tiffany?" I was less than 6 feet away from him. I still held the cloth I was using to wipe the table. His question didn't surprise me. In fact, I expected an argument like this to happen at some point, but I didn't imagine it would unfold this way. I looked him directly in the eyes, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible, though I already felt a burning sensation in them. I simply asked him, "How could you buy her a luxury handbag when the company is drowning in debt?" His face turned red, and he clenched his fists. I knew that look. It was always the signal just before uncontrollable anger erupted. "You try to humiliate me in front of my friends? You've really crossed the line." Without giving me time to say anything else, James turned abruptly and grabbed the belt hanging from the doorknob. I could barely take half a step back when I heard, "Today I'm going to teach you a lesson." The first lash sliced through the air and crashed against my back. I staggered from the sharp pain, feeling as if my skin were tearing. He didn't stop. "Emily, do you know how to do anything other than show off your parents' money since you came to this house?" I clutched my back, gasping, and said, "I gave you that money to pay your debts, not to give it to that woman." "Shut up," he screamed, continuing with the lashes. I don't remember how many blows I received, 10, 20, or perhaps more. With each strike, I didn't just feel physical pain, I felt my confidence shattering. I looked around hoping someone, anyone, would intervene, but there was no one. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Karen, was sitting on the sofa drinking tea calmly. Her voice resonated without emotion or surprise. "James is like this because he's angry. If a wife doesn't know her place, she has to be taught." I turned my head. "Mrs. Karen, how can you say that while watching me be beaten?" She looked at me. There wasn't a shred of emotion in her eyes. "You should reflect on your behavior." A wife who humiliates her husband. What is so unjust about receiving a few lashes? I was speechless. I didn't expect her to take my side, but I didn't know she would be cruel enough to consider it normal for her son to beat his wife. At that moment, my sister-in-law, Ashley, came out of her room. She stood behind the sofa with her arms crossed, looked me up and down, and smiled coldly. "Sis, do you think because your family has some money you can do whatever you want? If you come into this house and don't know your place, you deserve what happens to you." I looked at her. I no longer felt anger, only a deep, dark void remained, and I no longer had the will to resist. It hurt, but not because of the lashes cutting my skin. It was realizing that in this place, I was the only one not treated as a person. I wasn't a wife, nor a daughter-in-law, nor a sister-in-law. I was a doll named Cash Flow, a doll that knew how to serve water, cook, smile awkwardly, and keep quiet when insulted. I fell to the floor and with trembling hands took out my phone. Tears blurred my vision, but I fumbled for a familiar number and dialed it. My left hand was wet with a liquid I couldn't tell if it was sweat or blood. After 3 rings, my father's voice sounded on the other end. Calm as always. "Hello?" I broke down crying. The words stuck in my throat came out all at once. "Dad, I regret it." There was a silence of a few seconds on the other end of the line. Then my father, Mr. Roberts, said, brief but firm, "Prepare yourself. Mom and I are coming there." I don't remember how long I sat on that cold floor. I only remember that when I raised my head, the surroundings had suddenly become silent, as if all the sounds in the room had been sucked into a vacuum. There were no more lashes or screams, only my ragged breathing and the disgusting looks of the people I once called family. Mrs. Karen, sitting on the sofa, no longer feigned indifference and frowned, as if I were guilty of breaking the peace of the house that night. Her look was that of someone observing a newly purchased appliance that had malfunctioned. Ashley stood behind her with her hands on her hips, rolling her eyes with boredom. She said nothing more, but her intention was clear as she looked me up and down. In her eyes, I didn't even have the right to open my mouth anymore. And James, as if he had unloaded all the frustration of his life onto me, simply watched me. He didn't apologize. He didn't get angry. He simply turned around in silence and headed to his room. He still clutched the belt in his hand, as if ready to return if I dared say another word. I knew this silence wasn't out of regret, but out of fear of the call I had just made to my father, a call that wasn't long nor needed many tears. It was the moment when, for the first time in my life, I abandoned all my pride and patience and admitted I was wrong. I was wrong to believe that sacrifice would turn into love, and I was wrong to think that patience would bring respect. And the biggest mistake was marrying against my parents' advice. After that, time passed very slowly. I stayed sitting there. My back still burned, and I didn't dare lift my head, which was buried between my knees. Mrs. Karen sighed with annoyance, got up, and went to the kitchen, dropping the teacup abruptly onto the tray. Ashley went up to the second floor, stomping up the stairs deliberately, as if she wanted to bury me under the sound of her contempt. I don't know when James closed his bedroom door. I only heard the click of the lock. It was a cruel and cold rejection, devoid of any human warmth. An hour later, the sound of the front door opening made me turn my head instinctively. My heart started pounding. I didn't know if I should be happy or ashamed, but even in that moment, I wanted to stand up on my legs, trembling with pain and humiliation. My parents walked in. No one said anything, not a word of reproach, not a look of reprimand. My father walked straight toward James, who had come out of his room with an awkward expression, and stopped in front of him. Mr. Robert was a large, polite man, but his gaze was sharp as a blade hidden in a sheath. My father stared at him, unblinking, and said, "I have come to take my daughter." James pressed his lips together and muttered something. He seemed torn between his pride and his position. "Sir, it's nothing serious. I think there's been a misunderstanding." My father's expression didn't change. He said in a slow, clear, low voice but firm as steel, "No, this is not a misunderstanding. This is a disgrace." No one could answer. Even Mrs. Karen, who was an expert in arguing with the neighbors, now kept her mouth shut, looked at me sideways, and then looked away. My mother, Mrs. Susan, approached me. Without saying a word, she took my hand, the bruised hand I had been hiding under my clothes. Then she gently stroked my head and whispered, "Let's go home, daughter. You are too thin." I didn't protest. I didn't cry, nor did I feel the need to look back. I dragged the only suitcase I had brought when I got married. With my other hand, I clung to my mother's like a lost child who has found her family. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't explain. I didn't justify myself. I simply walked out that door, leaving behind the people who thought they could trample on my dignity at will. The sound of the heavy front door closing with a bang echoed sharply in the silence of the summer night. Strangely, that sound lightened my heart, as if I had finally escaped the quagmire I had been struggling in to please others. I didn't cry or tremble, but my heart beat very fast. I knew in that moment that it was the beginning of a storm, but it was no longer a storm directed at me. I remember clearly that night, sitting in the back seat of my father's Lincoln, feeling the wind on my face, leaning back on my soreness. Only one phrase circled in my mind: "There is violence that does not tear the skin, but destroys trust." And only 3 days later, they would come to fully understand the weight of those words. When I was younger, I thought meeting an enterprising man with the dream of owning his own business was the right choice. I didn't realize that some people use the armor of ambition to hide greed and excessive pride. James was 3 years older than me and worked in electronic component distribution. When we met, he was sincere. I'm not good with sweet words, but I want to build my own business with my hands, and I need someone who understands that." I believed him. I fell in love with his way of working in silence, how he sat hunched over his laptop every night. And perhaps I even loved his coolness, as if it were the mark of a man who has known the world's storms. My family didn't lack money. My parents owned a business. They were wealthy but lived discreetly. No supercars, no ostentation, but anyone in the industry treated our family with caution. However, when I said I would marry James, my father was silent for a moment and then said, "When you marry, you will have to learn to live according to your in-laws' customs. But remember one thing, don't let anyone trample on your dignity. Understood?" My mother was softer. She stroked my hair and said quietly, "Our fortune is still yours, daughter, but once you choose that path, you will have to walk it with your own feet." At that moment, I smiled. I thought my parents worried too much. I trusted James and firmly believed that love would eliminate all differences. The wedding was simple, but from the first moment, I began to feel an invisible wall I had to overcome. During the reception, my mother-in-law, Mrs. Karen, while adjusting my wedding ring, didn't forget to whisper in my ear, "Now that you're married and part of this family, you are no longer a wealthy princess. You have to learn to behave like a daughter-in-law of this house." I nodded without saying anything. I understood what she meant and thought that if I tried hard, she would change the way she saw me. At the party, James's sister, Ashley, passed by me and threw a sarcastic comment. "Why are you wearing such a luxurious designer dress if after the ceremony you're going straight to your in-laws' house and not on a honeymoon?" I just gave a slight smile and didn't react. I was afraid that if I responded, they would call me the rich, rude daughter-in-law. During the first days of marriage, I lived exactly as the daughter-in-law Mrs. Karen desired. I set my alarm 2 hours early. I got up before the housekeeper and went into the kitchen. I learned to peel fruit, set the table for family meals, and clean every corner of the living room. Although there was a housekeeper, on weekends I had to be in the kitchen because my mother-in-law had made it clear, if a daughter-in-law doesn't know how to cook, how is she different from a decorative doll in the house? Once I let my nails grow a little long, and as soon as she saw them, she clicked her tongue. "Why do you let your nails get so long?" A woman who only worries about her appearance is a useless person. I could only offer a bitter smile. Until then, I still thought that if I tried a little harder, everyone would understand and love me. But a month after we got married, James started asking to borrow money. At first, it was just $27,000. One night, while folding laundry, he told me. He urgently needed to pay a partner, but the cash was blocked in the system. I gave him the money without thinking and even said, "If you need more, tell me. It's hard when cash flow gets stuck in a business." James looked at me. His eyes shone in an unusual way. "Thanks, Emily. With you by my side, the burden is much lighter." With that single sentence, I felt all my sacrifice was worth it. But the second and third times, the amounts he borrowed were increasingly larger. Once he came into the room and hugged me from behind. "An opportunity has come up to import exclusive machinery from overseas. If I get this batch, the southern market will be mine, no doubt." I turned to him. "How much?" "About $275,000. I'll pay it back this very month. It's a bridge loan." I gave him the money without hesitation. I still thought we were building something big together. I didn't tell my parents anything. I didn't want them to think I had made a mistake marrying James. Now that I think about it, I realize that some mistakes are not made out of stupidity, but out of trusting too much. When I got married, the neighbors called me the cash cow. Not because I had special talent, but because everyone knew I was the daughter of a wealthy family. They had only seen the cars that arrived at the wedding, the jewelry I wore, and my mother-in-law's radiant smile beside me on the wedding day. I thought they were at least a little proud of me, but it was only the joy of someone who has caught the goose that lays golden eggs, and I voluntarily became that goose. James started asking for more money. His tone also changed gradually from softness to demanding. It was no longer, "Emily, can you help me?" but "Transfer it fast. It's urgent." One day, he handed me a purchase request for a car, twice as expensive as the previous one. "I need a new car to meet with clients. The one I have now gives a bad image. I hesitated. Didn't we buy this car a year ago? Besides, we're still paying the mortgage on the house. James frowned and threw the request on the table. I'm asking to borrow it. I'm not begging you. A wife shouldn't count every penny for her husband. I froze. I didn't know a simple question would make him so angry. But as always, I gave in again. Only after the car was delivered did I discover the owner wasn't James. It was an unknown woman, young and beautiful. It wasn't me. I asked him directly about the matter. He shrugged and said, "Oh, I put it in my sister's name. It's easier for the bank loan insurance. Don't worry, the paperwork is complicated." I had no more arguments to refute him. When a person decides to hide something, no matter how many questions you ask, the answer is silence or attack. The money kept flowing. Another day, James arrived late, and while taking off his shoes, said urgently, "I'm going to open a small factory just outside of Columbus, Ohio. This opportunity is really good. I need $440,000. We have to hurry to receive the material on time." I hesitated. "I'll ask my family's accountant how much money is left. The amount is very large, and I need to coordinate it." Before I finished speaking, he slammed the table hard. A glass of water tipped over, spilling liquid onto the wooden table. "Always with your family's money. Your family's money. Then what is my money for? Do you think I live off you?" That sentence not only silenced me, but also suffocated my pride. I didn't react. I didn't cry. I simply went to the kitchen, took a cloth from the cupboard, and with trembling hands wiped up the spilled water. I was too familiar with this feeling, being scolded, ignored, and having to accept it as if it were the duty of a wealthy wife. One afternoon, while tidying James's office, I found some strange receipts. Luxury handbags, perfumes, imported cosmetics. None of them were mine. I asked him with the receipts in hand, "What is this, honey? Have you hired a new female employee?" James didn't even look at me and said, "Now you're meddling in the gifts I give my employees too?" "But I ask because it was paid with the joint card. You ask too much," he snapped brusquely. His voice began to rise in pitch. The same tone he used every time he couldn't give an adequate answer, a tone I was already used to. I fell silent, but from then on, I began to vaguely suspect that those gifts weren't for just any employee. When I started to lose my way in my marriage, my mother-in-law also began to change her tune. During a meal, while picking up a piece of fish, she suddenly blurted out, "When I married your father-in-law, I got pregnant in 2 months. Could it be that people today eat and live so well that they struggle to conceive?" I stopped. The fork in my hand trembled slightly. I didn't raise my head, hoping my husband, James, would say something in my defense, but he, sitting next to me, continued eating as if he hadn't heard anything. My mother-in-law continued, "Of course, young people today know how to enjoy themselves, but they forget their duty to be mothers, so they can't be blamed." I bit my lip. I felt the piece of fish stuck in my throat. I didn't answer, not because I thought she was right, but because I knew if I opened my mouth they would call me rude. Everything exploded when I directly overheard a call from my sister-in-law, Ashley. That day I was passing by her room, and the door was ajar. She was speaking loudly. "My sister-in-law looks very glamorous on the outside, but it's all thanks to her family's money. In our house, she lives like a queen, eats well, and dresses up, but she's not capable of having a child." I froze behind the door. I felt a bitter taste in my throat. I simply thought that if I didn't resist, someday they would understand me. But that wasn't the case. My silence only gave them the certainty that they could trample on me. The turning point was when I checked the bank account again and discovered a large sum, about $275,000, had been wired from the joint account to a completely unknown account. I tracked the account holder. Tiffany. The name that had appeared several times in suspicious text messages I hadn't dared to question. The owner of the car registration my husband had bought. That night, when James returned, I waited for him in the living room. "Who did you send the money to?" I asked bluntly. James frowned. "What do you care?" "Because it's joint money, and I know you sent it to Tiffany." For the second time that week, he slammed the table hard. "If you have money, give it to me, and if not, don't ask. Do you think I live off you?" I was devastated. I tried to swallow the tears rising to my eyes. How many times had I given him money without a single piece of paper? How many times had I trusted him without any guarantee? How many times had I emptied my accounts, lied to my parents, and gathered money penny by penny for him? And now all that was treated like unwanted charity. I had nothing more to say. I simply sat in silence, like a shadow, like a person who no longer has a reason to exist. That night, back in the bedroom, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. In my head, only the question circled. What have I done wrong? But soon I whispered to myself, it's okay, endure a little longer. Then one day everyone will love me and understand my heart. That's how I consoled myself. I thought if I kept being good, everything would change, even though my parents told me several times, if it's too hard, just come back. Dad and Mom will always be here. I shook my head. I was afraid, not of disappointing my parents, but of people's malicious words. I didn't know to what extent that same submission was driving me away from my own worth. As I sat in the car, those memories passed one by one through my mind. The air was heavy, as if all sounds were compressed. Sitting in the back seat, I leaned against the window, letting the wind ruffle my hair, as tangled as my thoughts at that moment. My mother, sitting next to me, took my hand silently. Only with that gesture did I understand she knew everything, without me telling her, without anyone telling her. Perhaps just seeing the lash marks on my back, or the look in my eyes, which no longer dared to rise, my mother had already understood everything. My mother's other hand gently covered my shoulders with a fine blanket. That simple gesture made my heart sink to the bottom. How long had it been since I felt such tender affection? My mother said in a low, warm voice, "You have suffered a lot all this time. From now on, Dad and Mom will handle it." I pressed my lips together and nodded. I didn't have the courage to look my mother directly in the eyes. I was afraid tears would escape, but I didn't cry. I couldn't shed a single tear. Perhaps my tears had dried up long ago, or perhaps I had learned to hide them inside. Just as I had hidden all my wounds for the last 3 years, I felt like a child abandoned at an unknown bus station and found by her parents. But that child had already grown up. She had become so numb she didn't even know how to say sorry or thank you. From the outside, no one would guess the power our family held. A small mansion on a quiet street, cars that weren't flashy, clothes that weren't designer brands. My father still walked around the house in rolled-up sleeves and slippers like a retired worker, but behind that humble appearance was a position no one dared to challenge. Our family owned a controlling stake in a large conglomerate that supplied raw materials and managed logistics for the production chain in the industrial equipment sector, the very sector James so desired to enter. I thought my marriage was a personal matter. I didn't want anyone to interfere. I hid the fact that I had transferred money from my personal account and the nights I cried in the bathroom over my husband's strange messages. I didn't want to turn my marriage into a war between two families. I wanted to protect it myself, and my father, whom I considered indifferent, actually knew everything. He was simply waiting for me to open my mouth, and I made him wait too long. That same night, while changing in my room, I heard my father talking on the phone in the living room. The door wasn't closed, so I could hear every word. My father's voice was calm, but cold as a rock. "Prepare the documents to terminate all raw material supply contracts with Nexus Tech Solutions." I froze. Nexus Tech Solutions was James's company. On the other end of the phone, his secretary's voice replied briefly, "Understood. I will send it this very night." I stood behind the door, clutching the hem of my clothes. My heart didn't beat as fast as I had thought. Instead, I felt a strange and serene calm, as if I were listening, without a single word of resistance, to the sentence against the person who had trampled on me. I didn't go out and didn't ask. I simply sat silently on the edge of the bed. My hands trembled slightly. It wasn't out of fear, it was because I knew everything had begun. That morning at James's company, the monthly board of directors meeting was taking place. The weather was mild, and the sun filtered through the windows. Everything seemed calm. Everyone was in their seats, some drinking coffee, others glancing at last week's inventory report. At first, The atmosphere was orderly and neat as always, and small laughs were even heard when the secretary passed by. But the meeting room door burst open, and Sarah, James's secretary, entered. In her hands, she carried a thick ivory-colored hardback folder, and on top there was a red stamp of chilling clarity. No one in the room understood what was happening. They just frowned at the sudden appearance. Sarah, without saying a word, bowed her head slightly and placed the folder right in front of the CEO, James. Then she withdrew in silence. There was a moment of silence. No one was laughing anymore. All eyes were fixed on the words printed in bold on the folder's cover: Notice of Total Termination of Raw Material Supply Contracts. At first, James frowned slightly. He probably thought it was a mistake. He even gestured with his hand for Sarah to open it, but his gaze stopped as he read the note written at the bottom. He abruptly snatched the folder, flipped through the pages quickly, stopped as if thinking, reread it, and then jumped up as if he had received an electric shock. James's face turned pale, as if all the blood in his body had drained in an instant. Sweat beaded on his forehead and ran down his temples, and his hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them tight so as not to collapse. James's eyes no longer maintained their usual calm and twitched continuously as he tried to understand what the hell was happening, and in a moment of lost control, he slammed the table hard. Bang! The whole room flinched. The folder flew off the table and scattered across the marble floor. He screamed, almost a howl. "It's all because of that woman." That scream echoed in the cold meeting room like a slap in the face to everyone present. No one opened their mouth. No one reacted. Some exchanged furtive glances of bewilderment and fear. No one expected that James, who mocked his in-laws as if they were simple shopkeepers, would see his lifeline cut precisely by those shopkeepers. James still didn't understand. The trivial conversations, the days I visited my parents, the parties he didn't attend, all those were connections he paid no attention to. He thought I was just an ordinary daughter living well thanks to her parents being in business for a long time. He considered himself lucky that I had married him, a man building his own business. He used me at the beginning of his career, and when he thought his foundation was solid enough, he believed he had the right to oppress me because he thought I had no one to rely on but my husband. But now, standing in the middle of the meeting room, he had become a person with no one's support. And I, whom he had ignored for the last 3 years, was the daughter of the person who had just cut all supply contracts to his company. I wasn't there, but I could be sure of every detail. I was too familiar with his way of reacting. When faced with a situation he couldn't control, James always chose to blame others. And when he realized that the woman by his side was no longer a shadow, but a power capable of sinking his entire business, surely he went from anger to astonishment to panic. He would have learned that some lessons, simply for underestimating a wife, are paid for with a lifetime of work. I was still sitting on the balcony of my parents' house, watching the sunny patio below. My mother was watering the plants, and my father, as usual, was silent in his study. And I simply drank a cup of hot tea. I listened to the passage of time and waited for the panicked call that would come from the other side. I didn't feel happy or satisfied, only strangely calm, because when people have no way to save themselves, they realize the person they pushed away most was their last refuge. The call came on a cloudy morning. I was sitting in my mother's old study, sorting through some old notebooks from my childhood. My mother's phone rang on the table. As soon as I saw the screen, I knew who it was. My mother-in-law, the same familiar number that called me every night to give me instructions on what to cook. A call that hadn't come a single time since I left that house suddenly appeared on the screen. I answered, not out of compassion, but because I wanted to hear what they had to say after all this. "Honey." Her voice was still slow and calm, but it hid a calculated intention. "I don't think what happened the other time was such a big deal for you to leave home. After all, you are a married couple, and James's company is in danger. Don't be so harsh. If his company goes under, your reputation will also be affected." I didn't answer immediately. I looked out the window as the wind swayed the pots of chrysanthemums my mother had just planted. Only after a long while did I say in a voice low but firm as steel, "I lost my reputation a long time ago, Mrs. Lintapentek and Karen. Now it's James's turn to feel what that's like." The other end of the phone fell suddenly silent. There were no sighs or pleas, nor the usual hints to belittle me. Only the sound of beep beep, and the call cut off. I put the phone down and took a deep breath, not to regain calm, but to fully feel this moment where I wasn't reprimanded because the daughter-in-law, who had been beaten until she bled, dared to answer back for the first time. That afternoon, my father called me to his study. This morning, we sent the official communication to terminate all collaboration with Nexus Tech Solutions. I stood next to my mother with my hands clasped, looking at my father. My mother said nothing to me, but she leaned slightly toward my father and said in a voice barely audible, "Don't think about forgiving the person who hurt my daughter so much." Hearing those words, I felt my chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from pain, but from the feeling of being protected. It had been a long time since I heard such firm words. How long had I had to live in deception and false silence to protect my husband's reputation? I didn't cry, but my eyes grew warm, not from resentment, but from the fact that for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to carry everything alone. That same night, our group sent a notification to all our major partners. It contained a single sentence, brief but chilling. Supply of raw materials to Nexus Tech Solutions is suspended indefinitely and without negotiation. The entire system seemed to tremble. Rumors spread much faster than I had thought. In less than 24 hours, a component supplier from Illinois also announced they were suspending the renewal of a new contract with James for fear of chain risk. When one pulled out, a second followed. When the second got nervous, a third voluntarily withdrew funds. The supply chain was like a chessboard shaken, and the piece called Nexus Tech Solutions, founded a little over 2 years ago, began to crumble. Meanwhile, James's company plunged into unprecedented chaos. Meetings were postponed continuously, and employees began to murmur. Some departments requested voluntary leave. People said, "Why did the supplier cut everything suddenly? What is happening? Surely there's a legal problem. Is someone pulling strings?" There were rumors they didn't do clean business. James called desperately here and there, but no one gave him a clear answer. Then, suddenly he must have remembered me. He started searching for the messages and call history he had sent me, but I didn't answer. He didn't understand why everything had collapsed so quickly. He didn't understand why all the connections and people who had so praised his vision and encouraged his rapid expansion had turned their backs on him. He didn't understand that a woman he had ignored at every moment had now become an entity whose name he didn't even dare to pronounce. I didn't feel happy or satisfied. I simply sat on the roof of my house, watching people pass below. And I thought, if I hadn't stood up that day, if that day I had continued choosing silence, I probably would have remained forever as a shadow in my own life. And what horrifies me most is that they had become so used to my silence that they thought I didn't know how to resist. But that's not true. Everyone has a limit. And when a woman like me, who had emptied her accounts to protect the reputation of an unfaithful husband, turned around with determination, it was time for him to realize that everything has a price. I wasn't surprised that my mother-in-law called again the next morning, but what made me hesitate a little was her voice. It wasn't the arrogant and cutting tone of always, nor the sound of someone clicking their tongue or sighing, feigning compassion. It was a voice soft as cotton candy and chillingly sweet. "Honey, come back. In life, everyone has their ups and downs. Let's sit all together and talk things face to face before things get so complicated that no one can fix them." I kept silent for a few seconds, so she would think I was hesitating, but actually, I knew from the first moment. The reconciliation she spoke of was just a farce, an empty shell to cast blame and transfer all responsibility to the person who had left. But still, I went back not to reconcile or to beg. I wanted to see them face the ruins they themselves had created. The white-painted iron gate was still the same. Only today I was no longer the person waiting for dinner trembling behind the wheel, swallowing tears by force. I pushed the door and entered. The living room still smelled of the familiar pain relief ointment. My mother-in-law, Mistress, Karen, was sitting in the middle of the sofa with her back straight, hands on her knees, and a calm expression, as if nothing had happened. James was sitting to the left, slightly slumped, with sunken eyes and his head a bit down, like a pale shadow of what he used to be. And my sister-in-law Ashley, with her arms crossed over her chest, was leaning against the back of a chair, looking at me with an arrogant gaze. The air was heavy, and for the first 5 seconds no one opened their mouth until my mother-in-law spoke. The sweet voice had disappeared, replaced by a familiar, cold, and deep tone. "After all, you were also the daughter-in-law of this house. I think family members shouldn't drive each other to the brink. Why don't you reflect a little on yourself?" Before I could open my mouth, Ashley slapped the table and interrupted. "Aside from your parents' money, what do you have, sis? In the 3 years you've lived in our house, what have you done right? And now, over a simple couple's fight, you cause this scandal and make your parents harass my brother this way. You have nothing to be happy about, only that your parents know how to play dirty." I turned to Ashley. This girl had never hidden the contempt in her eyes, and now, without needing to keep up appearances, she was letting it all out. "That I haven't done anything right?" I replied in a tone neither high nor low, steady. "If it weren't for my money, would your brother have this company now, or has everyone forgotten that?" James raised his head. His voice was tired, but there was still resentment in it. "I know you're angry, but does this way of cutting supplies and sinking the company make you feel better?" I looked him directly in the eyes. The look that had once made me crumble countless times was now empty. "You call it doing it to you? Then why do you think those companies collaborated with your company before this, a newly opened company with no reputation? Do you think it was because you were talented and cultured?" "It was all thanks to me. Did you know that?" My mother-in-law started to get irritated, and her voice cut with every syllable. "Honey, I've already told you. Everyone makes mistakes. First, you have to admit your mistake and think about the next step. Things aren't irreparable." I tilted my head slightly and let out a short sigh, as if exhaling, but it was actually to suppress my anger. "Apologize, Mrs. Karen? What should I apologize for? Should I apologize for investing my money in my husband's company and now watching it collapse? Or should I apologize for having been the cashier of this house, the ATM so he could buy lipsticks, luxury items, and cars for his mistress?" The space fell completely silent. No one could say a word. Even Ashley, whose mouth was faster than her brain, sat stunned. I continued, this time slower, with every syllable clear. "If this is a reconciliation, then I guess it refers to the way a mother-in-law pressures her daughter-in-law to shoulder the blame and dump all responsibility on the one who left. I'm sorry, but I didn't come to hear that," and as if the sky were beating the drums of a storm, knocks sounded on the door. They weren't light, but firm, resonating like an alarm bell. I knew the climax of this play had just begun. The door flew open. The dry and sudden sound made my mother-in-law jump. James also turned his head sharply with a pale face. The person who entered was a young woman. She was dressed flashy, in a tight dress, intense red lipstick, and voluminous wavy hair, looking fresh from the salon. She didn't look at anyone, didn't even say hello. She simply walked straight to James and held out a paper coldly. "Give me back my money." Her voice resonated clearly in the silent living room. "You asked me for a loan to invest in opening a coffee shop, and now you disappear. You don't answer the phone, you ignore messages. Did you think I was going to get scared?" I sat silently observing the situation. James stammered. "Tiffany, don't do this here. This is my house." "Ah, this is the respectable house you told me about. The house where the mother-in-law calls the daughter-in-law a cheap gold digger and the sister-in-law spits in her sister-in-law's face for not being able to have children." Her eyes, filled with contempt, swept over each person. "Perfect. Today I have come to collect a debt, with my head held high. I haven't done anything wrong. You owe me money, and now you have to pay. I don't care how anyone lives or how they raise their kids." Ashley was almost crying, her face pale and unable to move. My mother-in-law jumped up, approached the door to drag her out, and said with a trembling voice, "Who are you? Who told you to come to my house to cause a scandal?" Tiffany didn't flinch and smiled. She took an envelope out of her purse and threw it on the coffee table. "Have you forgotten me? I'm the person who has been sleeping with your son for the last 2 years. Ever since you called me a cheap slut, your precious son held me in the best hotels several times a month, I wasn't surprised because I already knew, but her bold and determined tone tore through the entire room like a bomb explosion. Mrs. Karen collapsed into the chair. Her hands were trembling, and her face was pale, without a drop of blood. Ashley hid quickly behind the stairs, showing only a look filled with confusion and terror. And James lost his mind. He ran to push Tiffany out of the house. "Get out! What do you want? This is no place for you to talk." But Tiffany dodged him. She took a step back, pulled out her phone, and held it right in front of his face. "Touch me. I'm going to start a live stream right now. The whole country loves this stuff. The CEO's wife, cheated on. Hypocritical mother-in-law, violent sister-in-law. It's perfect drama. Neighbors outside, did you hear? I'm not the mistress. I'm a victim of fraud. They took money from me and used me, and now that I come to claim my rights, they are threatening me." I looked toward the door. Suddenly, a crowd of neighbors had gathered. Some stood on the steps, others took out their phones to record, some clicked their tongues, and others started pointing fingers. "Oh my God, that Mr. James seemed like he was doing so well in business, but he's been cheating on his wife for 2 years. Wow, and I heard the mother-in-law of that house was very strict. Good Lord, what's the use of making a lot of money if now people come to your house to claim debts on a live stream? What a shame." My mother-in-law buried her head, unable to lift it. James, sweating profusely, tried to take the phone from her, but he no longer had any justification to do so, and I remained sitting in silence, saying nothing, not reacting. I had seen enough of each of the people who taught me to be quiet for the peace of the house, the people who overturned the plate of food I had prepared, and accused me of not being a good wife. Now their true faces were being exposed. I didn't need to unmask them, they said it all themselves. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door. Some gazes fell on me, and I clearly heard some whispers. That lady seemed so quiet, but she's a fearsome woman. Surely she knew everything. If she stayed quiet, it was to wait for them to show their true faces themselves. I didn't look back even once, because I had no attachment left. In my head, only one thought resonated: it's over. This wasn't an argument, it was the collapse of everything they thought they could control. I still vividly remember that morning. It was exactly a week after Tiffany went to my in-laws' house and revealed everything. From that day on, everything was like a burst underground water main, sweeping away the family that had once reigned over me without any shame. Early in the morning, the local grocery store was already full of people. Shoppers pushed carts to buy and sell. Amidst that bustle, with the sound of carts rattling and chatter, my ex-mother-in-law, Mrs. Karen, stood dazed next to the produce section. In her trembling hand, she held a few crumpled bills. I was only told about it, but every word was like a slap in the face to someone who once dedicated herself to lecturing others. A woman nearby said in a sharp but clear voice, "Hey, isn't that James's mother? The one who was on that live stream the other day? Tsk. They say he cheated on his wife and even kicked her out of the house." My God, how can someone be like that? Mrs. Karen was so startled that she dropped the few coins she had. The coins, falling onto the linoleum floor, lay precariously near a spilled display of vegetables like her own dignity. No one tried to help her pick them up. She stammered, No, you have the wrong person. It's not me." Before she finished speaking, a man nearby added with a mocking voice, "Of course it's you, ma'am. You used to go everywhere bragging that my daughter-in-law is from a rich family and my son is a winner, and now, look how great this is. Aren't you ashamed?" Hearing that, she lowered her head and with trembling hands picked up the money. People passing by stopped, some pointing, others staring, as if it were the morning show. She looked around for an escape route, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. Every step was a humiliation. That noon, the scorching sun beat down on the roof of the place I once called home. In the third-floor office, James sat, absent. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair soaked in sweat, and his look was that of someone who hasn't slept well. The office door burst open, and my ex-sister-in-law, the arrogant Ashley, entered. Her face was pale as paper. "Brother," she murmured, "HR just called me. They say it's difficult to keep an employee involved in last week's social media scandal." James frowned and stared at her. "What?" Over a stupid video? Aren't they exaggerating? Ashley took a step closer and, barely holding back tears, said, "It's not an exaggeration. It's the truth, James. The company can't afford to have someone with a bad reputation." Then James, filled with anger, smashed his phone against the desk. Bang! The bookshelf shook. The phone screen cracked diagonally as proof that everything was crumbling in his hands. "It's all Tiffany's fault. That bitch came and ruined everything. She was the one who caused the scandal," he screamed. But this time Ashley could no longer maintain her arrogance. She broke down crying, and mixed in her sobs was reproach. "It's all your fault. If you hadn't been so irresponsible, if you hadn't cheated on your wife and beaten her, we wouldn't have reached this point. Why do you always blame others?" And so the siblings who once despised me were now tearing each other apart amidst the ruins they themselves had created. It didn't end there. The next day, James's company received mass contract cancellations from clients. Messages related to lawsuits rained down, and people demanded damages, the return of advances, and the recovery of investments. The employees were restless, the legal team was plunged into chaos, and no one could keep calm. A business partner called James. The voice coming out of the speakerphone resonated throughout the room. "I thought you were a decent person, but with debt problems, infidelity, and the embarrassment of a live stream, now the whole neighborhood knows. Who is going to want to keep doing business with your company? It's best you close down." James remained silent. His hands trembled, but this time he didn't scream or break anything. He simply shrank, watching as wine spilled from a tipped glass soak the documents, just as his past lies had soaked his life. James's face at that moment, according to the cleaning lady, was sunken and pale, and his eyes had turned black as ink. The man who once stood on the podium of glory was now sitting like a failure, trying to cling to his honor with rotting hands. And as the straw that broke the camel's back, that night in the cold living room, he received a text message from Tiffany. It wasn't long, nor loud, nor complicated, just a few lines, but heavy as a rock thrown onto the surface of a lake. "What we had is over a long time ago, but debts are paid. Resolve it fast on your own." Without waiting for his answer, Tiffany turned off her phone and cut all contact. I was told that night James cried like a child. He went through the house desperately calling Tiffany's name, and with every call he erupted into a fit of anger. Like a person fallen to the bottom of a well, the more he screamed, the more his voice cracked. Outside, the wind blew hard, like the mocking laughter of fate. The man who had cornered me was now sinking into the deep hole he himself had dug. I still remember that night, a drizzly night, cold and silent. Outside, the rain fell like a light sigh, as if the earth were trying to silence the remaining sadness. I was preparing dinner with my mother. Today's dinner was simple: pot roast with potatoes and carrots, and a side of green beans. But in that atmosphere, everything was supremely peaceful. While the whole family was eating, knocks sounded on the outside door. A weak but persistent sound, as if the person outside had hesitated a long time before gathering courage. When I went out, opening the door slightly, I felt a strange sensation and froze. It was James. He was standing in the drizzle. He looked incredibly haggard. His shirt was wrinkled, and he no longer wore a watch on his wrist. His hair, wet from the rain, was disheveled, and his face was so sunken and pale that it took me a few seconds to recognize him. James's voice was hoarse, and the smell of alcohol emanating from him was nauseatingly strong. Mixed in it was a pathetic desperation. "I was wrong. I was really wrong. Give me a chance. Just one." "I'm really sorry." I didn't answer. I looked at him for a long, long time. Long enough to remember all the days I knelt before his mother, the days he abandoned me, the money I gathered so his company would grow, which was treated as if it were from a greedy gold digger, and the marks of the belt James left on my back that night. But I simply raised my hand in silence and gently pushed the door to close it, without a word of reproach, without an insult, because I knew that very silence would be something he would never forget. When the door closed, the rain outside also stopped. I turned around to go back inside. I walked slowly, as if saying goodbye to a shadow that no longer belonged to the present. My mother had just put the bowl of soup on the table. She raised her head to look at me and asked, as light as the wind, Was it him? I nodded and sat opposite my father. My father, who had lived his whole life calmly and never said a nasty word to anyone, silently put down his chopsticks, looked at me for a long while, and then asked, "Are you okay?" I gave a slight smile. It was no longer mixed with tears, but it contained everything that had passed. "I'm fine, Dad. The things I did, the people I passed by, I have no regrets." No one said anything else, but I could clearly feel my father and mother's gaze, a gaze full of love, but one that didn't interfere with my decisions. They had seen it all. They had rejoiced with me, suffered with me, and now respected me as a mature person who had risen with her own dignity. At that moment, in my heart, there was not a shred of regret, nor resentment, nor anger, nor reproach, only the lightness of having finally closed a chapter of my life full of wounds. I was no longer the daughter-in-law who received reprimands from her mother-in-law at the table, nor the wife who emptied her accounts for a man who didn't know how to respect. It was me in my totality, and in the moment of silence of a simple dinner, I felt my heart lighten. The day I left, I thought I had lost everything, but it turned out that those who had lost the most were not me, but them who no longer had me to lean on. Sometimes silence is the most powerful answer. Not everyone who leaves is a loser. Some breakups happen not because love has ended, but because the other person no longer deserves our sacrifice. And in the journey to find oneself again, sometimes giving up is not a failure, but a way to recover peace. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that you are not alone. Walk out bravely from the place that hurts you.